The topic today is physiatrists must see clear regarding climate change. Well, the goal of this presentation is that you will act on climate change today. And there are going to be 3 easy ways I'm going to give you to do this today during my talk. And then Alex is going to focus more on the issues of disability and climate change. This has been the hottest summer ever around the world. There have been unprecedented floods. There have been unprecedented fires around the world. And some strange events too, such as massive orange-sized hail. And this is a picture from Italy. Climate change affects everyone's lives. Now, if you're just a person, many people will stay inside in the heat, the bad weather, or the extreme cold. It's something we must do. And everyone, when they don't go outside, what happens? Well, it's like COVID, right? There's decreased exercise, fitness, and it can have a negative impact on mental health. And we know that there's actually forest bathing as a way to improve mental health. So climate change affects everyone. But it also causes medical problems. And these medical problems that can occur have been shown to occur in increased amounts with climate change are asthma, stroke, cardiovascular disease, dehydration and heat stroke, skin issues. In addition, there are certainly infectious diseases, vector-borne diseases, and diarrheal illnesses. But one thing I'll say is that there's a vast preponderance of research in the infectious disease arenas, but not in the top arenas. And we're hoping that will change. Asthma, allergies. Why do these occur? Well, with increased growing seasons, increased heat, these problems are going to occur because of the increased greenery. Allergies are very, very prevalent these days. And when you take air pollution gets worse in the heat with that increased ozone then, and this results in increases in people with COPD, in terms of respiratory illnesses, people with chronic bronchitis. These have all been shown to be increased with climate change and heat. Well, what about the other extreme? Many times we think about climate change and we think about the increased heat, but notice the word bomb cyclone and the polar vortices. We hear about these when I was growing up. We didn't hear about these even 10 years ago. But now these are becoming annual occurrences. And with the cold, what happens? Well, with the extremes in weather, we also have problems like heart disease. And for those of you that are in an environment where there's snow, it's a common occurrence for people to do things like shovel snow. And what happens? They have a heart attack shoveling the snow. Stroke is also more common in weather extremes. And again, these are all issues that down the pike result in physiatric visits. In the extreme heat, it's not just the elderly that are impacted. We have dehydration, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke, and this also occurs in the youth. And we've seen many cases where there'll be kids that are out on a field, they're playing a game, they're practicing, and you'll have a death that occurs that way. So those are just general climate change effects. There's also the disaster effects. And this is the Disaster Rehab Committee. And there are many problems that happen in disasters. We're aware of these probably much more than problems associated with climate change, but these include spinal cord injuries, brain injuries, amputation, amongst others. And just a little levity here. For those of you that don't believe in climate change, just look around on the clothesline and you can see how through the years, people have adapted to the increased heat. Looking at this picture in a more holistic fashion and thinking about the issue of disability, something Alex is also going to touch on, but I'm going to touch on here too from a more medical standpoint. There are many different disabilities. And when there are different disabilities, people's functional needs are different. And people with disabilities are much different than most populations that are looked at in terms of climate change. You may have heard of the needs of indigenous peoples, the needs of people in specific places like small island states, needs of people in cities. But people with disabilities are harder to follow and understand because they don't live in groups. So when we look at people with disabilities, we have to think of, well, what are their physical, motor, sensory, emotional, cognitive, functional, and socioeconomic concerns, in addition to medical. So they've got all those things. And depending on what the type of problem the person has, they're going to need different supports. People with disabilities also have equipment, assistance, supply, and medication needs. And this occurs when disasters strike. When disasters strike, depending on who the person is, they're going to have different concerns, different issues based on their disability. So when we think about disability, we also have to think about acute versus chronic issues. So the acute issues are the responses to disasters. The chronic issues is with climate change, how do you adapt to daily life? And then how are people with disabilities responding in the future? Again, for those of you that have just joined, this is an interactive talk, and you can join us at menti.com on your computer or your cell phone, and then put the code in 58811163, and you'll be able to participate. So if you take people with profound disabilities, such as spinal cord injuries, ALS, MS, these people have significant problems than people with other disabilities, such as hearing impairment or blindness, don't have, right? Problems with poikilothermia in the case of spinal cord injury. People with MS get worse in the heat. They've also got problems with pressure ulcers, and they need knowledgeable caregivers. They're going to need wheelchairs and equipment and supplies such as catheters. And all of these issues will have ramifications. How? Well, they have ramifications in terms of acute problems, right? If there is a disaster, there's the issue of getting the wheelchair into a shelter, needing supplies, which might not be there, needing caregivers, which can also be a problem for getting into a shelter. If it's a more chronic problem like the heat, people with spinal cord injuries are going to have ways to adapt to the heat. And if we're thinking about the long-term issues of climate change, and we think of the issue of survival of the fittest, the question is, what about supplies such as catheters? What are they made out of? Plastic. So we've got to think in terms of how people with disabilities are also going to be considered as contributing potentially to the problem of climate change. And we've got to try to become more carbon neutral in all groups. And in fact, one of the problems with climate change is the issue of carbon emissions. And slowly, the medical community is now getting involved in terms of decreasing their own carbon emissions. All right, special concerns with sensory disorders, difficulty with awareness of disasters, inability to be in cramped shelters for people with TBIs or autism. There may be a need for powered devices and caregivers, need for transportation, which might need to be different than the average individual. And then again, there's, of course, other individual needs. So we've got to think about these special concerns and how they are going to impact the person. We've also got chronic issues associated with climate change. And one thing I haven't discussed yet is the mental health aspects. The mental health aspects of climate change may be bigger than anything else. Anxiety about the future, There's a term called solastalgia, which is sadness about the environment around you changing. There can be guilt about what you've done to contribute to the problem. Clearly, depression. I would, in many ways, hate to be a young person growing up now and thinking how the world has changed. And then when there is trauma, there's the issue of PTSD. And we only need to think about Puerto Rico and the hurricanes that happened in Puerto Rico. With Maria, there were so many issues. And then a couple of years later, there's another hurricane coming. And when you're on an island, it's hard to leave. In terms of climate change and disability, we've also got the common issues, which can include the socioeconomic concerns. There's a double risk in regards to the need for migration with climate change and disability due to temperature or flooding. Impoverishment can prohibit people from being able to control their environment, finding food and shelter. And persons with disabilities are also prone to dual diagnoses, such as depression related to disability, pain, and addiction. Back to some interaction. The question is, what can you do about this? What can physiatrists do about this? And I need you to type in your answers here. I'm going to wait for at least 3 answers before I go to the next slide. So if you're not on menti.com, please join us and give us some responses. And I'll give you a hint, there's an obvious answer if you look at this picture. It might be a little bit more creative, but if somebody gets the right answer to the picture, I will also move forward. Got 6 answers, okay? The other thing physiatrists can do, and I'm going to answer this question here, is look at the background. This is all meat. Another thing physiatrists can do is encourage plant-based diets, because plant-based diets are climate friendly. It takes a lot of carbon, and there's a huge carbon output when you're eating a meat-based diet. So this is what I want you to take home here. This is the mnemonic CCLEAR, and CCLEAR stands for communicators. We can be communicators to our patients, professionals, just our general community, because in fact, healthcare providers are trusted sources of information. We can be climate leaders, and hopefully I can give you some tools to become a climate leader today. You can read books, obtain training, and you can plan based upon this training. You can be educators of your patients, trainees, colleagues, neighbors, and community members about the health risks of climate change and added value solutions, such as plant-based diets. Plant-based diets are healthy, plus they help with climate change. You can be advocates for climate-friendly policies to eliminate fossil fuels, to transition to those plant-based diets, decrease air travel, and actually fast fashion. And you know, this is something I recently learned. Do you realize 95% of clothing these days has some type of fossil fuel component to it? And how much does air travel cause in terms of climate emissions? It's incredible. Finally, we can research the impact of changes in our care on carbon emissions, and we can work on improving health. How can we be communicators? During patient histories, we can ask about the heat impact. That's a great way to bring up climate change. We can talk about the need for preparedness for our patients. And I'd love to work with any of you in this group that wants to work on advocating that to be part of what CARF internationally requires for centers, because I think this is really important. We can Make sure people know that climate change is human caused and that greening is good for you personally, planet, and also in terms of healthcare, your finances, or maybe not your finances, but the finances of the institution. Finally, other specialties have created scripts to speak to their patients. And this is something that I think is really important that physiatrists do. One of my jobs is I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of Climate Change and Health, so I have the ability to see what's going on in other specialties. And we can really learn from them and kind of catch up with them. Climate leaders. All right, there's two books here. Drawdown is a book about solutions. I encourage you, it's a fast read, and you'll get a lot of knowledge about climate change in this book. And How to Avoid a Climate Disaster is the book that Bill Gates published last year. Another quick read where you'll learn about things such as new buildings and how much carbon is actually created when you put down concrete. There are also some other places I encourage you to go to get knowledge. One is there are position statements written. There is a position statement from ISPRM on climate change and disability, and I encourage you all to go read this. Back to my other slide here. How am I going to do this? Excuse me for a second. Here I am. And there is also a position statement written by the Association of Academic Physiatrists, call to action, again, available freely, and it's important that we're all aware of these statements. Excuse me here. Gotta get rid of some of my screens. All right. There's also the Journal of Climate Change and Health. And this is a gold open access journal. Again, I encourage you, the easiest thing to do with this is sign in and set up alerts. You can get alerts this way, and once you get the alerts, it's like free education about climate change and health. So I strongly recommend that you do that. Then, this is a course that's coming up this weekend, and I encourage you all to look at it. The agenda is quite robust, and I've been quite involved to this, but it is a meeting on climate and health. It's actually the first meeting around the world that people have been able to submit abstracts in. And we have about 20 abstracts coming in from around the world. Actually, I'm going to call out Tazla Mudin, who did submit an abstract and will be speaking at the meeting. And this meeting is free to all students, and it is also free to people from LMIC to attend virtually. It will be recorded, so if it's not in your time zone, that will be good. But one of the most interesting things about this meeting is we're going to have scoping reviews performed, and they will go into all these different specialties, and we're going to identify where we have excess knowledge and where the knowledge gaps are. And you'll see here there's also a scoping review on PM&R. So again, Climate Health 2023, I encourage you. If you want to get like more specific training on how to speak about climate change, one organization that I have done training with is the Climate Reality Project. And this is an organization Al Gore started back in 2007. I was in the second group, but they really are training people now around the world. There's climate reality projects on every continent except Antarctica. And if you want to get really to be a climate leader, I would encourage you to do that. All right, educators, you can be an educator, by in all these areas. You can educate patients about disasters, heat, climate change, medical students, residents, healthcare professionals, your colleagues in your practice or in your hospital, community members. And one thing is, Alex and I are both part of Sustain Our Abilities. It's an NGO, and we have physiatrists from 5 continents or even 6 continents, and we work together. We have therapists involved and people living with disabilities, and we are working on creating tools. We are working on creating a slideshow that will be shared for residents and occupational therapists, and we would love you to help in creating tools for other disciplines or to translate into Italian, into Greek, into Arabic, into Hindi, so that we can have similar tools used around the world. Also, advocates. And with advocates, really, I'm not thinking about advocating for your patients now. These are other reasons we can advocate. And I'm going to give you a few examples here because I think this may be difficult for people to understand. This is another QR code. I encourage you all to scan it. I'm going to leave it here for a second. It is a project of my own and Sustain Our Abilities. In fact, it's the way Sustain Our Abilities started. My own story is I used to speak about sexuality a lot in spinal cord injury, and I realized that it was next to impossible for me. I could get asked to speak about sexuality all over the world, but to get the issue of climate change on an agenda was incredibly difficult. So I decided to do a walk. And I started a walk from Canada to Key West, which led me to starting the nonprofit Sustain Our Abilities, which led to all other things, including me starting the Journal of Climate Change and Health in conjunction with Elsevier. And next year I'm going to finish it. But the walk now has been changed to being called the G, the GRAM, the Green Route Aiding Healthy Adaptation and Mitigation. And the thing that I've learned along the route, and we've also done these events in different places. You might recognize Steve Flanagan. Some of you might know Steve Flanagan. This is the former Commissioner of Disability for the City of New York. And this is another physiatrist. I was walking in DC. But along the route, what I did was I gave grand rounds in person. This was before COVID. I had to stop because before COVID, but I made my way to Richmond, Virginia, where one week it was hot in Richmond, Virginia, as you can see. And at the end of the week, I was in North Carolina and it was snowing. So you can see from this how the weather changes so rapidly now, right? And that's the point I'm going to bring up. But I had originally wanted to see people with disabilities on my route. I didn't see any. It was too hot for people with disabilities to be outside. So I then went to Puerto Rico, and Gretzel Dillon brought me around, and I interviewed many people in Puerto Rico that had lived through Maria. And their stories are available on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to go back and finish the route soon, next year, and I hope you sign the letter. That's one way you can take action tonight. Another thing is the idea of Day for Tomorrow. We believe community can conquer climate change. It's really important that people get together, and we encourage you to have events at least once a year in your local area. October 22nd is 6 months before and after Earth Day, so it brings attention to this issue. And this might be a time when you do an event at, in the community, but it can also be a time when you just have an educational event in your facility. And our Sustain Our Abilities partners who are in Greece, I think Yanis Dionysiotis is on this talk. Yanis, I apologize if I didn't say your name properly, is giving a course next week. And this is a picture of a girl in Nigeria. They did a planting tree event for Day for Tomorrow last year. So, getting near the end of my presentation, researchers, you can do waste audits. That'll help you figure out where you can save money. You can do the carbon footprint of your actions. You can look at sustainable supplies and devices. Telerehabilitation is green. We can do more research of telerehab. plant-based diets. Maybe plant-based diets are better than taking pills. And exercise in green space. If we all walked places, if we all rode our wheelchairs places, we would have less carbon emissions, and it will help people have a more balanced lifestyle. We did a study a few years ago, and at that time, over 50% of rehab professionals had already felt their patients had been impacted by climate change. One thing is, this was a study done by rehab professionals. We've got to make certain that in the future, we include people with disabilities in the design of our studies. So on that note, thank you for participating. My email is here, and I am going to turn this over. Again, Climate and Health 2023 or Climate Health 2023.
This is kind of a high level overview of the way to conceptualize how disability is connected to climate change. As I said, there's a little bit of overlap, but I hope this will help to give another perspective. Essentially with climate change and disability, climate change has numerous impacts on society. There are also many types of disabilities and aspects of living with a disability, and these can vary by location. When I say this can vary by location, I think that's important because your jobs as physicians often is quite local. So if I'm over here in California talking about wildfires and maybe atmospheric river type storms, that's going to be different than somebody who's living in the middle of the country and is dealing with more tornadoes and kind of other heavy thunderstorms. That's just an example here in the United States, right? Internationally, it's also quite different depending on location. But in terms of climate change impacts, you have things like extreme weather, both in general and then specific types of extreme weather. Damaged infrastructure, when storms happen, when the oceans rise, it can damage infrastructure. Economic consequences, if you can imagine, loss of property, damaged infrastructure, crop losses, things like that that come with climate change, harm the economy, and therefore, kind of by extension, affect quality of life and well-being. There's also harm to government capacities when government is spending more money on climate-related things and also potentially getting in less money because the economy has been harmed, then that shrinks the amount of government capacity to address other social and, in your case, medical issues going on around society. Potentially, there can be effectively uninhabitable areas, either due to recurrent extreme heat, due to sea level rise, due to desertification, due to assorted different climate impacts. That and various other consequences can lead to dislocation. Some storm happens, your home gets destroyed, you get dislocated and move somewhere else permanently. Potentially proactive migration. A good example of this is Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana, here in the United States, and they are working to actually relocate an entire community at quite an expensive cost, but doing so because of sea level rise. And we're seeing that also in small island states and just other locations. Spreading disease, Marcalee already mentioned this, but essentially, you get more standing water, then you get more mosquito-borne disease. Also, there can be expanding vectors for tick-borne disease, and then kind of damage of ecosystems can push animals closer to humans and kind of get some of those zoonotic diseases jumping over. Then social upheaval and conflict. This unfortunately can happen due to migration pressures and kind of resistance to that, and assorted other reasons, conflict over things like water resources. In terms of disability, you have broad categories of disability, such as mobility or intellectual and developmental disabilities. You can have specific disabilities, such as multiple sclerosis. I personally have a spinal cord injury, a C5-6 spinal cord injury, so there would be one. Different people with disabilities and disability groups have different use of and need for government services. So this is kind of narrowing things down to the disability category or even the individual level. Use of medical care and attendance, then housing needs. Does somebody need due to thermoregulation issues, really good insulation and air conditioning? Do they need wheelchair accessible housing, things like that? Mobility and transportation. So person's ability to drive, possibly their ability to afford a car, and therefore being more inclined to use public transportation, things like that. Economic barriers and opportunities. The disability community internationally is economically disadvantaged compared to the able-bodied population. And then intersectional factors around race, income, and other issues can affect either broad disability groups. The community of African Americans with disabilities is going to be different than the white population, just if you look at kind of broader indicators, and then at the individual level, it's different as well. Now, what are the connections here? Here I have 8 kind of general factors on either side, and connections would be each of these 64 lines, right? Every single one of these is a valid point of inquiry around climate change and disability. Maybe in your work, you might only kind of look into one of those things. You might look into multiple connections here. And each of those is a valid point of inquiry around disability and climate change. Then we can dig deeper as well. Here's an example of just looking at extreme weather and disability categories. And you can see the 64 lines are still there. And then each of these lines between, different types of extreme weather, which here would be heavy rain and flooding, tropical cyclones, so hurricanes and typhoons, increased thunderstorms and increased prevalence of tornadoes, extreme heat events, both in intensity, frequency, and duration. Fire weather, which is hot, dry, and windy weather, can spark up fire. And then there are, dangers that come with that, as well as, say, here in California, we've started shutting off the electric grid in some areas to prevent kind of sparks from sparking fires. And if you can imagine your patients and some of the people that you work with that have electrical needs for their disability, if the power goes off, then that can endanger their health and well-being. Other things would be windstorms, knocking out infrastructure and power, cold snaps. Kind of one aspect of climate change is that the jet stream that hovers both at high northern and then low southern latitudes gets a little bit windier and can bring in some Arctic or Antarctic cold air to areas that didn't usually get very intense cold snaps. We saw that here in Texas. That led to a large amount of deaths in recent years. Then blizzards and heavy snow. Basically, a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, and therefore, in the middle of winter, do things like pull more moisture off of lakes and then lead to more heavy snow events and blizzards. In disability categories then, so here's, again, looking a little bit more deeply, mobility disabilities, people who are blind or low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, people with chronic pain and or fatigue, folks who are immunocompromised, people with psychological disabilities, with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and then with learning disabilities. These are kind of the broad disability categories. Within each of these, you could look at a specific disability, but if you can imagine that each of these 64 points, again, is another valid point of inquiry. I think one of the points I'm trying to drive home here is that if you look at climate change and disability, in many ways, it can encompass almost anything. And something that I like to talk to the medical community about, to the disability community about, is that no matter what work you're already doing, you're probably already doing something good when it comes to disability and health and climate change. So you might be addressing one of these lines, and more power to you. You might be interested in addressing more of them. And then thank you for doing so. And you're making a big difference if you are. Now, digging into kind of the individual impact, and this I think is important for you all as physiatrists when you look at a specific disability and a specific climate impact. Disability can be broken up into medical factors, such as people's baseline health, their medical risk factors, and healthcare needs. And then also there are social factors that impact the disability experience. Economic barriers, different accessibility needs, and different independent living needs. And, within the disability activist community, often people say, I'm not disabled because I can't walk upstairs. I am disabled from reaching that second floor because there isn't a ramp or an elevator. The lack of accessibility is what is disabling to me, not my medical limitations or impairments, as you might call them. I think that there's reality is somewhere in the middle, right? And that's important to look at both sides of this. Then you can say, okay, what is this specific climate impact doing to each of those medical factors and social factors? Interrogate each of them. On the medical side, then you have considerations, health considerations. On the social side, you have structural considerations about how a climate impact affects a specific disability. Take all of those together and you say, okay, we understand the problem, let's develop some solutions. You can have medical and rehabilitative interventions. You can have personal actions to increase personal resilience. You can have infrastructure investments, government response, sufficient services, and then also climate action. So I'm going to dig into each of these a little bit and talk just from the perspective of my experience, which is uh, a C5-6 spinal cord injury, and then extreme heat events. Here we have extreme levels of heat stress have more than doubled over the past 40 years and will continue to progress and get worse until the climate change slows down from us kind of reducing emissions. I think you all probably know relatively well how lack of thermoregulation, that would be my experience with a spinal cord injury, could put someone at risk to extreme heat stress. So I'm going to talk about the social factors here so that you can kind of see, all right, what's the experience of my patients with spinal cord injury with disabilities, and break that down. So some economic barriers would be benefits cliffs. This here in the United States is where if somebody earns $1 too much, they lose potentially thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in disability support services. Then there are also increased disability-related expenses that just comes from medical expenses, transportation expenses, et cetera. The connection to heat waves on that would that the economic kind of disadvantage that comes from that limits the amount of spare money for adaptation and air conditioning bills. Another barrier is limited employment options. I myself am not going to be able to do non-manual labor. There may be employer discrimination against people with disabilities as well. Connection to heat waves is that there could be a potential benefit from non-outdoor work. Then there could also be difficulty finding work in lower heat stress areas. I can imagine San Francisco versus Phoenix, Arizona. If I can't find work that fits my skill set, and that kind of gets past employer discrimination in San Francisco, but the only available jobs for me that I can find are in Phoenix, I'm going to be at more risk for heat stress. Then lower pay due to employer discrimination, lack of job opportunities, constrains adaptation. In terms of accessibility needs, I need a wheelchair accessible housing. I personally think that apartments are best. You've got one level and they're already relatively accessible, at least the newer ones are. Connections to heat waves is that insulated and appropriately cooled buildings are more expensive. New apartments do have limited cross ventilation, at least here in the United States, due to some of our design standards. Elevator, if there's an elevator in an apartment building, it could become inoperable in a power outage and strand somebody either inside or outside the house. So another accessibility need would be outside of the home would be accessible buildings, restroom, and lodging. So a connection to heat waves would be potential difficulty finding accessible cooling shelters or hotels with proper heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And then you can imagine that the economic barriers might make it more difficult to afford a hotel with AC during a heat wave if my home isn't properly ventilated with good cooling. Independent living needs. We have one need would be wheelchair accessible transportation. So for example, a minivan with somebody driving me, uh, public transit, paratransit, and or pedestrian and bicycle pathways. My power wheelchair is fast enough to go down a bike lane, so good for me, I guess. Then connections to heat waves would be difficulty being outdoors during extreme heat events. So that would make going down a pedestrian or bike path more difficult. Waiting at a bus and train stop, an outdoor one, could be extremely difficult, especially if there isn't proper shading. Some trains and buses are hot inside. Another consequence. Transit may be out of service, during extreme heat events or power outages that can affect rail. We had some warping on a train track here recently in the Bay Area, and that led to our transit system being temporarily out of service and then delayed. There could also be extra costs or logistics for using a minivan if I have to pay a caregiver to drive me instead of using public transit, or simply if I decide, hey, you know what, I'm going to have to pay for a minivan because I can't deal with this outdoor extremely hot transit problem. Another independent living need would be personal care attendants at least twice a day and having funding for them. Then connection to heat waves would be that attendants may have their own difficulties. For example, their own health and maybe transportation barriers of their own. And then if I cannot go out to run errands, I may have to chip in some extra out-of-pocket pay for errands and assistance with heat, assistance with heat being somebody to come over and help spray me down with a spray bottle. That would be, if my home isn't appropriately cooled. So some solutions and brief examples here on the medical and rehab would be to have low energy use cooling systems, such as cooling vests or spray bottles if somebody doesn't have air conditioning, helping them manage meds that affect temperature regulation. Now, these are things that you can help your patients with or otherwise advocate for. Personal actions would be to seek housing with good HVAC and insulation, if at all possible, and if somebody can afford it. Then also to understand income and benefits and pursue work. I mentioned some of those cash cliffs, but there are opportunities for people with disability to pursue work in ways that can give them more financial buffers to withstand heat waves and other climate impacts. Infrastructure investments would be to reinforce the electric grid. This isn't your job as physicians, but perhaps this is something that you would want to advocate for outside of your work. Then to improve the housing stock to have better HVAC and to be more accessible. A government response would be to coordinate accessible cooling shelters and hotels. Then to revise benefits rules on income and assets. I certainly think, government actually could reach out to physicians like yourselves to better understand the impact of heat waves on people with spinal cord injuries. And then physicians could reach out to the government and try to give them that information as well. Sufficient services would be funded and well-managed attendance services so that I can have extra care during heat waves. Then services to support home renovations and utility costs. Unfortunately, there's a bill here in California to make it so Medicaid can pay for air conditioning upgrades to homes. That has stalled in committee, but those are the kinds of legislation that can really improve health and well-being. Then for climate action, reduce emissions, that's a big one. And then electrify everything is also a great way to reduce climate emissions. Then finally, actions for physicians, things that you can do. Here's some overlap with Marcalee's presentation, but learn about your local climate impacts. This is important because you're going to be interacting with your own patient group. And you might not need to learn necessarily in depth about climate impacts somewhere else. Research and brainstorm medical considerations for your patient population. Talk with your patients about medical impacts and try to figure out interventions for them. Also discuss each of their social considerations and related concerns. Some of your patients may be on public health care and be concerned about earning money. Some of them may not, but have other concerns related to heat waves or other climate impacts. Then help your patients prepare for planning personal resilience actions. Loop in social workers or other team members as needed This should be a kind of a complete continuum of care to support your patients. And then finally, join in on climate action and advocacy. There were really a lot of great bullet points that Marcalee put forward for things that you can do. So thank you. And then I think we have all of 5 minutes for Q&A.
I think we had some comments that Farouk wanted to give. And I just wanted to say before Farouk, we are going to have some follow-up presentations in conjunction with ISPRM, and we will be talking further about lowering your carbon footprint and education. And if you want to join us, we would love to have you join us as part of Sustain Our Abilities. We speak about once a month with our international group and talk about solutions and ways we can get the word out about climate change and disability. Farouk?
Yeah. Hi, Alex and Marcalee. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So first, yeah. So hello everyone again. So my name is Dr. Farooq Rathore. I'm currently the chair of the Disaster Rehabilitation Committee at ISPRM, the International Society of Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine. And I'm really grateful to Marcalee and Alex for their wonderful presentation. Just to let you people know that this is going to be a long-term collaboration between Sustain Our Abilities and DRC ISPRM. And hopefully every 3 to 4 months, we are going to have one webinar. Hopefully next time we are going to advertise this webinar in detail, and probably you guys can actually send us questions and ideas on which topic we should be doing this webinar. And if you have some specific question or some specific action plans that we would like Marcalee and her team to speak on, that would be really great. So I would formally like to thank Marcalee and Alex again for their wonderful and very enlightening presentations, and really hope that people have got some action plans that they can actually integrate in their personal and professional lives to make this world a better place for our kids and for generations to come. So Marcalee and Alex, thank you again. I'm really grateful.
All right. And again, anybody, if you want to attend Climate Health 2023 or have your students attend, it's going to be 2 days of learning, and it's free for all students and all residents and fellows and for people from LMIC. So just please consider, and then you can, if you can't be there during the daytime, when it happens first, it will be available on our YouTube channel.
And also, if you are curious to learn more about climate change and disability, Marcalee provided a lot of great resources. We are working to centralize a lot of climate and disability resources on our website over at sustainourabilities.org. I had that right at first. So sustainourabilities.org/resources.html.